Hey everyone, and welcome back to Daily Tuition. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can use Redux Toolkit in the React application. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can work with Redux Toolkit. I'm going to create a very simple example in Redux first and then convert that same example into Redux Toolkit. As well as you will completely going to understand how you can use Redux Toolkit in your React application. So let's get started and see how you can add Redux Toolkit in the React application. As you can see, I'm using Visual Studio Code, and inside that I have here a project, a React project. Now, as you know, to create this React project, you have to open your terminal and just enter into your project directory and specify a command npx create react app and then specify your app name. Now, I already done that, so I'm going to specify a name to my application, which is RTK Redux Toolkit, and then I'm going to enter into my project directory and execute a command npm start to start the development server. So this will open the React project. Now, once you have your React project, I'm going to just first open the source folder, and inside that, in the app.js, here you have the default React JSX. Let me get rid of this and add here h1 heading tag, and I'm going to say here Redux Toolkit. Let me save this. So this will save the changes, and you will have here a title Redux Toolkit. Now, just for that, we need to install Redux and Redux Toolkit in this React application. To work with Redux and Redux Toolkit, you have to first install it. So let me first open the documentation of Redux Toolkit. So I'm going to say here Redux Toolkit. I'm going to open the documentation of Redux Toolkit. So you just have to head on to reduxtoolkit.js.org. This will open the Redux Toolkit documentation. Click on the Get Started. And here you can find you have different ways to install Redux Toolkit in your application. Now, if you want to create a React app with Redux, you can use this command. Or if you already have the existing React application, you can execute this command. So I'm executing this command. So I'm going to copy this, open my terminal, enter into my project, and then I'm going to say here npm install Redux.js Toolkit. As well as, because we are comparing Redux and Redux Toolkit, let me install Redux as well. So I'm going to say here React Redux. Now, once you have both these libraries, let me just back to my bash, and if I open here package.json, here you can notice I have here Redux.js Toolkit and React Redux library. Just after that, let me back to my app, and here we're going to create a very simple counter application. So for the counter application, as you know, we need two buttons. So let me create here a button with increment text, and then I'm going to copy this button, paste it just down here, and instead of increment, I'm going to specify here decrement, something like this. So we have two buttons here, and between these two buttons, I have here a span tag with 0. Now this application is just for explanation. So if you want to add styling to it, that's upon you. You can add that. Now what I want, if I want to increase the value by 1, I can click on this increment button. And if I want to decrease the value by 1, I can click on this decrement button. So first I'm going to create a Redux store. Now, if you don't know basic concepts of Redux, then make sure you watch my previous videos. For example, why we use Redux, how you can use it, and why the Redux is useful in the React application. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to create a new folder here inside the source, and I'm going to name it Redux. And in this folder, I'm going to create a Redux store. So to create a Redux store, as you know, we need store.js, we need a Redux store, then we need a reducer. So I'm going to create a file as well, reducer.js. inside the same Redux folder, and then we also need here a file called action.js. Now if you want, you can add the action code inside a reducer as well, but I'm going to separate all these three files. I'm going to just open here store.js file. Now to create a store, you need to call create store function. So to create a new store, we need to first install Redux library in this project. I'm going to open my terminal, open the bash shell, and here I'm going to first clear the screen, and I'm going to say npm install Redux. So I'm going to install the Redux library in this project so we can use it. So once you install the Redux library, let me close this terminal, and here I'm going to say import create store, and I'm going to grab this create store function from Redux. And once we have that, I can just simply say here constant store is equal to create store. I'm going to call this function, and to this function we need to pass a reducer. So I'm going to pass here a reducer called counter reducer. Now, as you know, right now I don't have this variable inside this project, so I will get an error message for that. So just for now, let me just export default store, something like this. So now this will create a simple store in your React application. This store needs a reducer. So to create a reducer, we back to the reducer.js. Here we create a reducer. Keep in mind, we are using Redux right now. We are not using Redux Toolkit. So we are creating the same example with two different libraries. So first we are using Redux, and then I'm going to show you how you can use Redux Toolkit. Now in the Redux, we create a Redux reducer. So to create a Redux reducer, I'm going to simply create here a function, counter reducer, and then I'm going to pass here curly braces. So this is a very simple function. Now let me first export this function as default. So I'm going to first export this function as default so you can use it in my store.js. Now let me save this. Back to the store.js. Here I'm going to say import counter reducer from the reducer file. And then I'm going to pass this counter reducer function to the store. So now the Redux store is now completely ready. Let me save this file. Back to the store, and let's create this store. Now as you know, to create this store, you need to first specify the default state. So I'm going to pass here state is equal to, and then in the curly braces, I'm going to pass value 0. So I'm going to pass value to this counter 0, the default value to this counter. And then as a second parameter, you get action. Now you will get this action parameter value from your component. Now just out of that, here I'm going to say switch action.type if, in the case if it is equal to increase, then I'm going to return an object with value state dot value. So I'm going to call the default state value here plus 1. As I said, when I click on the increment button, I'm going to increase the value of the default state by 1. And let me do the same thing for decrease. So here I'm going to say case, if it is decrease, then I'm going to return value state dot value minus 1. That's it. And at the end, I'm going to say here default. Make sure you return the default state. So I'm going to say here return state. So if nothing match, it will return the default state. Let me save this file back to the action.js. Now inside this action.js, we create the actions. We create actions in the function format. So I'm going to say here export constant increase is equal to, and then I'm going to pass here a function. This function is going to return object. So I'm going to call here curly braces, and I'm going to say here type, and this is the increase type. This is the action of type increase. So in the action, I'm going to pass increase, something like this. This is my first action. Now to return this action, instead of these curly braces, I can just pass here parenthesis, something like this. So instead of the return statement, this function is going to return this object. Now just out of that, to create another action, we can copy this function, paste it down here, and instead of increase, we say here decrease. And then I'm going to change the type, and this is a type of decrease, something like this. Save this file, save this reducer file as well, save the store file as well, and then I'm going to back to my index.js file right here. And then we are going to wrap this app component in the provider component. So from the provider, we can access the store in every component. So to do that, I'm going to say here import store from // specify the folder Redux, and inside that I have store. Just out of that, I'm going to say here import. In the curly braces, we pass provider, and we get this provider from the library React Redux. So we get this provider component from the React Redux and get the store from the store file. And instead of this React strict mode, I'm going to pass here provider, something like this, and make sure you pass that here as well. So we're going to just wrap this app in the provider, and then to this provider we pass the store variable. So I'm going to say here store is equal to, in the curly braces, we simply pass the store. That's it. We successfully created the Redux store. Let me save the changes back to my app.js, if I want to access this store, I'm going to simply access that using use selector hook. So I'm going to say here import. In the curly braces, I'm going to say use selector from React Redux. And right here, to get the initial value of the state, or you can say the store, I can just simply say here constant count is equal to use selector, and in the use selector we pass the callback function. This callback function is going to have the state, so we can access the initial value of the store. And I'm going to just console.log that first. So I'm going to say here state. Let me save these changes. As you can see in my console, I'm going to have the initial value of this store. So now if you use this use selector in any component, you can use the central store. So you can access the same value in any component. And now if you want to increase this value, you call the dispatch hook. The dispatch hook is going to call an action, and that action is going to increase the value of the state, or you can say increase the value of the store. So let me just call here a function, or you can say a hook, which is dispatch. So I'm going to call here use dispatch, and then just out of this count, here I'm going to say constant dispatch is equal to use dispatch, and you have to call this dispatch in the onClick event. So to this button, here I'm going to say onClick, and then I'm going to call here a function, and then I'm going to say dispatch. I'm going to call this variable dispatch. In the parentheses, we need to call an action. As you know, we have actions inside the action.js. So let me just import that file here. So I'm going to say here import. In the curly braces, we pass increment, or you can say increase. You can see in the action we have here increase variable. So I'm going to pass that here increase from Redux action file, something like this. And then I'm going to pass this increase function to this dispatch, something like this. So when I click on this increase button, I want to increase the value of the initial state by 1. Let me show you. When I save the changes, when I click on the increase button, you can see now the value of this state is 1. When I click on the increase button again, I'm going to have 2 here. So this will increase the value of the state by 1. I'm going to do the same for decrease as well. So if I say here onClick, call here a callback function, or you can say the handler function with dispatch hook, then I can call here decrease action. So I can call here decrease. Oops, I think I misspelled the decrease spell. Yeah, right here it's decrease. Let me save this and let me import this in this import statement. Here I'm going to say decrease, and I'm going to call this decrease function in this dispatch, something like this. Let me save this, and now when I click on the increase, it's going to increase the value of the store by 1, and when I click on the decrease, it's going to decrease the value of the store by 1. Now if you want, instead of using these functions, you can use this object as well, but Redux documentation recommend to use a function instead of this object. And then just out of that, you can call this count instead of this hard-coded value, something like this. As you know, right now inside this selector, we just console.log a state. So instead of state, I can say state, this state, and we have a property to it which is value, something like this. Let me save the changes. You can see I'm going to have here 2. When I click on the increase button, it will increase the value of this counter, and when I click on the decrease button, it will decrease the value of this counter. So this is a very simple example of Redux. Now let me show you how you can create the same example with Redux Toolkit. Now once you understand how you can make this counter example with Redux, let me show you how you can create the same example with Redux Toolkit. As you know, we install the Redux Toolkit using npm install redux.js toolkit. Now to include Redux Toolkit, we need to first configure the React store. In the Redux store, we use create store to create a new Redux store. Let me close all these files, and in my source folder right here, I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to name it toolkit. And inside this toolkit, I'm going to create a new file, store.js and reducer.js. Now, we don't need any action file to this Redux Toolkit because Redux Toolkit is automatically going to create different actions using Reducer. We will look at that after a few seconds. Just for now, open the store. To create a new store in Redux Toolkit, we need to import here a statement. Import configure store from Redux.js toolkit. And then you have to say here constant store is equal to configure store, and in the parentheses pass here an object. Here inside this object you have different properties. So here I'm going to call a property called reducer. Using this property you initialize this reducer function, and inside this object we create different reducers. So let me first save this file and back to the reducer.js, and then here we're going to create the reducer. So we first create the initial value for this reducer. I'm going to say here constant initial state is equal to, specify here value 0. Now once you create the initial value for your reducer, let's create a new reducer. To create a reducer in toolkit, you have a function which is create slice. This function is going to accept the reducer function. So let me first import in the curly braces create slice from Redux.js toolkit. And just down here we are going to export a function constant counter slice is equal to, and then I'm going to say here create slice, and in this parenthesis we configure, or you can say initialize, the reducer. So we first specify the name for this reducer. So I'm going to say here name, we get the name property, and we specify name for this reducer counter. Then we pass the initial value as a second parameter. So I'm going to pass here a comma, and then I'm going to pass this initial value to this reducer. So this function is going to first create and specify the name for this reducer and then pass the initial value. And after that, you can create here reducer with the reducer property, something like this. And then inside this, you have your reducer functions. So inside this reducer, let's create the first reducer, which is increment. So if I say here increment, pass here parenthesis and pass the function, something like this. So this is going to create the first reducer. If you want to create the second reducer, you can pass here a comma and pass here the second reducer. That's simple, right? Now inside this first reducer, as you know, we get the state and update that state, or you can say increase the value of that state by 1. So we pass here state parameter first, and then here we're going to say state dot value plus equal to 1. So we increase the value of the state by 1. We first get the initial state and increase that by 1. Let's do the same thing with a decrease. If I say here decrement, call here a function, something like this, we can access the state using this state parameter. And if I say here state dot value minus equal to 1, then this is going to decrease the value of the state by 1. And then you need to generate your actions. As you know, we don't have any actions inside this toolkit. When you call this create slice, this is automatically going to create actions. So whenever you want to access or execute any reducer, you don't have to create actions manually. Instead, you can use these functions. For example, if you simply say here export constant, and if you destructure the counter slice dot action from this function, then this function is going to return an action. So this is a type of action. You can access that and destructure that in this object. So you can simply say here increment and decrement. And just out of that, you can simply say here export default counter slice dot reducer. Make sure you export the reducer as well, because we are passing this reducer to the store. So this is a very simple reducer in Redux Toolkit. So this is how we can create a reducer in the toolkit. Let me save the changes back to the store. Here I'm going to say import counter reducer from Redux reducer file, and then we pass here counter reducer to this reducer parameter. Here I'm going to say counter and pass here counter reducer. That's it. Now make sure you export this store variable. So you have to say here export. Let me save this file. Let me save this file as well. Back to the index.js, and instead of this Redux store, we're simply going to import store from Redux Toolkit store.js. Now, do you know why I pass here curly braces to access the value of this store? If you know that, let me know in the comment section. So I'm going to just access the value of the store using these curly braces, and then I'm going to pass this to the store. Everything will be the same. This will restart the server, and after that, we need to back to the app.js. And as you know, inside this import statement, right now we don't have anything. So let me just get rid of this Redux action, because if you're using Redux Toolkit, you don't have to use any action. You will get the action from the reducer file. So it's just simply going to say here import. In the curly braces, you will say increment from, in the single quote, I'm going to say Redux Toolkit reducer.js. And from this reducer, we're also going to call decrement. So this reducer is going to export, as you can see, action call increment and decrement, as well as the same file is going to export the reducer. So I'm going to access this increment and decrement action in this app.js. Now once I've done that, instead of this increase, I'm going to pass this increment action like this. And instead of this decrease, I'm going to pass here decrement. And now if you inspect this state, then you will see, if I say here console.log state, when I save the changes, you can see you're going to get an object with the counter property. And inside this counter, you have here a value 0. You'll get the store value. Counter is the name of your reducer. So what we have to do is, instead of returning state.value, we have to say here state.counter.value, something like this. And now when I click on the increase button, it's going to increase the value of this counter. Oops, I think I misspelled something. We need to just pass here dot / and reducer. Let me save the changes. And now if I back to the app.js, save this file as well. And if I click on this increase button, it's going to increase the value of this counter by 1. And it's going to decrease the value of this counter by 1. Now what if you want to get this increase and decrease value using user? So let's suppose if you want to get the value from the user and use that value to increase the counter, then how you can do that? To do that, you can simply create a new reducer in the reducer file. You can simply pass here a comma, and then you can say here increment by amount, and then you call here your state and the callback function. And then here what you have to do is, as I said, when you get the value from the user in reducer, you have to pass here another parameter, which is action. Using action function, you get the value inside a reducer. So when you call the action function, you need to pass value to this reducer. So as a second parameter, we pass here an action. So here I'm going to say state.value plus equal to action.payload. Now inside this payload property, you get the value of your action. So to get the value from the user, you can simply add the action parameter to the reducer. So let me just copy this increment by amount and pass that to this constant variable. So let me just export this. Let me save the changes. Back to the app.js, and here I'm going to say increment by amount. I'm going to first import this function, and then instead of increment, I'm going to pass increment by amount. Right now, I don't have any value here. What if I pass here a value 5? Now, when I save the changes and when I click on this increase button, this is going to increase the counter value by 5. You can notice. And when I click on the decrease button, it's going to decrease the value of this counter by 1. So here we basically use the action parameter to get the value from the user and pass that to the reducer. So this is how we can easily use and create this counter example using Redux Toolkit. If you want to know more about Redux Toolkit, don't worry about that. I will make a project on Redux Toolkit, so I will completely understand how you can use that in the big React project. So I hope you understand how you can work with Redux Toolkit in the React application. If you find anything useful, make sure to press the like button, share this video with your friends. That is all for now. I will see you in the next one.